Okay, it's starting. All right. Greetings, fellow software enthusiasts. Today we are launching our Green Software events, and we are thrilled to introduce our special guest, Annie Freeman, a talented software engineer at Xero in New Zealand. She will be discussing how software engineers can contribute to solving climate change. We firmly believe that this topic has a very high importance, and we are deeply appreciative of Annie for helping us raise awareness and sharing valuable tips and insights on developing environmentally friendly software. And you will start with a 30-minute presentation, after which we will have time for a Q&A session. By the way, you can post your questions in our real-time chat without the need to wait until the end, and feel free to start posting your questions right from the beginning. Enjoy the talk, and we trust you will find it useful.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me just share some slides. Right. Every day we see the carbon emissions that we're creating from our cars, the piles of rubbish we're making, and we see the extreme weather events happening all over the world. And we try to make changes. We switch to electric cars, recycle, or reduce our fast fashion consumption. But what we often don't notice is the carbon emissions that are being created as a result of the software that we are building. So, today I want to ask you and share with you, can engineers help solve climate change? I want to share with you today how you can change the way that you build your software in ways that optimize and reduce its electricity usage so that you too can contribute to helping solve climate change. Hi, my name is Annie Freeman, and I'm a software engineer based in Auckland, in New Zealand. Thank you so much for inviting me today and having me on your first green software event. It's really exciting to be here, especially for a group on the other side of the world. So thank you so much. I kind of fell into this topic a couple of years ago when there really wasn't that much research, not much people talking about it. And I wasn't even sure if there was much potential in this area. It just seemed like writing some clean code and that was it. But since then, there's been an absolute explosion in the amount of people talking, researching, and taking action in the green software space. So that's why I'm so passionate to share with you today the three main ideas I'd love for you to take away from this talk. Firstly, that software does in fact contribute to carbon emissions. Secondly, that by changing the way you build software, you can achieve the same outcomes, but in a way that is using electricity much more efficiently. And thirdly, that small changes can have a really large impact if we all do our part. First, a little bit of background information. The commonly accepted goal to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change is for the world to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. You may have heard of a similar term, carbon neutral, which is where all emissions are offset by something else. However, the priority with carbon neutral isn't on reducing those carbon emissions. The problem becomes that we just don't have enough offsets available in the world to offset all the carbon emissions that we're creating. So instead, we are focusing on net zero carbon emissions. Here, the priority is on reducing those emissions as much as possible and then only offsetting the absolutely unavoidable carbon emissions. One of the main ways to do this, of course, is reducing our reliance on fossil fuel sources of electricity. It's really important that we make renewable sources of energy cheaper and more accessible than these fossil fuel sources. However, in 2022, 2/3 of the world's electricity was generated through fossil fuels still. So we've got a little way to go. But where does software come into all of this? Well, the demand for technology is only growing. The number of internet users has more than doubled since 2010, and the IT sector is expected to consume 14% of the world's global electricity demand in 2040, which is quite a lot. If the electricity used to run the software has been generated through fossil fuels, then that software is contributing to carbon emissions. Another great example of this is countries that have emerging data center markets. In Ireland, for example, the data center electricity use has more than tripled since 2015. And in 2022, data centers consumed 18% of the whole country's electricity. What actually uses all this electricity? This is simply things like transmitting data over the internet, running the servers, or running the systems that cool a data center. So because software uses so much electricity and the demand for electricity is continuing to increase, how can we adopt new or different ways of building our software that achieve the same outcome but reduce and optimize the electricity use? The first step is changing the shape of the electricity demand to reduce our reliance on those fossil fuel sources. This chart is a representation of what an average electricity demand looks like during a normal day for a household. So it's really low after midnight when you're sleeping, a peak in the morning when you're up and getting ready for the day, a little bit lower in the afternoon when you're at work or school, and then another peak in the evening when you're at home, making dinner, watching TV, and getting ready for bed. My electricity provider in New Zealand offers what's called an hour of power. Basically, you choose 1 hour during the day, and any electricity you use in that hour is completely free. The catch is, of course, you can't choose your hour during those peak hours of the day, so where these grey bars are. For example, you could choose your hour of power to be from 3 to 4 p.m., say where this green bar is. And the idea is to incentivize you to move some of your power use to those off-peak times of day. Now, this is great, and it kind of gamifies electricity use. A friend of mine tells me how her boyfriend loves this, and he will get the notification on his phone that the hour of power is about to start, and he will rush around their apartment, doing the laundry, having a shower, doing the dishes, and doing all the chores to try and maximize their free power. But why do they offer this? Say, for example, we're in a region that has mostly renewable sources of energy. But during times of day when there's a really high demand for electricity during those peak hours, it may be that the electricity generated from the renewable sources isn't enough to meet that demand. So to meet the demand, the electricity grid has to turn to non-renewable sources to make up for that gap in demand. They do this because fossil fuels such as coal, for example, are really easy to generate on demand. So if you need to suddenly create more electricity, you can get that really easily from the fossil fuels. So by incentivizing people to move some of their electricity generation to those off-peak times of day, it reduces our reliance on the fossil fuels as it is less likely we'll need to turn to those sources. So now let's apply this to software. every application that runs, every job that needs doing, every time you run a data analysis or do a deployment, it all uses that same electricity. But when you're working on your company's application, you might not have the same constraints on when you need to use electricity as a normal household would. So think about common jobs that need to be run regularly. Say, for example, you have a database that you need to back up once a day. And in this example, let's assume that it takes 1 hour to run that backup. However, you might not need to run that job, that backup, at the same time every day. This chart here shows the carbon intensity of a hypothetical region that a data center is running in. Times of day where the electricity is being generated from fossil fuels means that more carbon emissions are being emitted and the carbon intensity will be higher. At other times of day, when more renewable sources are being used, that carbon intensity decreases. In this example, your job might run every day at this time. It's just set to run at the same time, and no much thought has gone into when that is. But the carbon intensity where this grey bar is a lot higher than other times of day. So why don't you just shift the time that you run that job to 1 hour later? Here, the 1 hour job in green runs at a time when the carbon intensity is much lower. Seems simple, right? Well, here's where you might want to take a note. You can get the data that informs which time of day is the best to run your job and will have produced the least carbon emissions from different APIs. One of them is produced by the Green Software Foundation called the Carbon Aware API. It has different endpoints that allow you to figure out which time of day will produce the lowest carbon emissions. So this is a really great example of just changing the way you do things in a way that will achieve the same outcome with your software, but in a way that is using electricity more efficiently. So what you could do is, using this API, find out the time of day in the region that you're running your application in or your job, and find which time will have the lowest carbon emissions for that day, and automatically set the job to run at that time. A team of engineers and I recently created a proof of concept of this idea where we built a Kubernetes cron job, and we set it so that at the start of each day it would figure out which time for that day would be the best time to run that job, and then dynamically update the time settings for the cron job to spin up at that specific time and run the job. Another really cool example of this is Microsoft. They have been making improvements to improve the sustainability of Windows 11. And one thing that they've done is running Windows updates at times when the carbon intensity is lower. A lot of these background updates don't really matter to the user when they happen if they're just going on behind the scenes. So it was a great opportunity to take advantage of the best time to run that job. So have a think, what things happen in your software that don't necessarily have to occur at a specific time. Another method is called demand shaping, and this is where your application monitors the current carbon intensity during the day in that region you're running your application in. And when the carbon intensity is lower, prompts the application to run more of its workload during that time, and then decrease it again once that carbon intensity increases. The other lever that we can pull to ensure we're using renewable energy is location. Some data center locations are more likely to use renewable energy sources than others, just depending on what infrastructure is available. But also within each location, the makeup of that electricity grid changes throughout the day. Wind and solar, for example, only generate electricity 20 to 30% of the time. And if it's not windy or it's not sunny, and you might not be able to generate enough electricity. So at nighttime, for example, if you're using solar power, you have to use non-renewable energy sources. So again, using the Carbon Aware API, you can look at a range of regions to determine which one is best and shift your workload to run in that region. So we've looked at a couple of ways that you can change the way you do things to achieve the same outcome. But this concept can really be applied to anything. Does your software have peak times of usage? Could you incentivize your own users to spread their demand across the day so that it's not using electricity at peak times? I would also encourage you to talk to people in other industries about this concept. A friend of mine is an architect, and I was explaining this concept to her, and she immediately thought, hey, we have these digital renders of building plans that always take a long time and a lot of resources to process. But to be honest, they really don't need to be run at a specific time. We could, if we were able to, we could totally run them at off-peak times a day to reduce our usage of electricity at those peak times. So if your company produces software for other businesses, how can you help them take advantage of this concept? At this stage, you might be thinking, well, what happens once all of our electricity comes from renewable sources? Well, first of all, we need to accelerate the uptake of renewable energy globally. Cloud providers such as AWS are doing a lot to try and use renewable energy in their data centers, but we need to make it as easy as possible for all industries to switch to renewable sources of energy. This would be really difficult if our electricity demand continued to increase, and we wouldn't be able to keep up with it. At the moment in New Zealand, a couple of data centers are being built for the first time, which is pretty exciting in our little corner of the world in New Zealand. But in New Zealand, we have a lot of renewable energy sources, but these data centers are going to add a big increase in our electricity demand. And so the electricity grid has to provide for all its normal demand for households and businesses, but now also this extra energy from the new data centers. And so if our renewable sources of energy can't keep up with it, then we will have to prolong the amount of time that we are relying on fossil fuel sources of electricity. Once we do get to 100% renewable energy, we have to be able to maintain that. And again, that could be difficult if we're constantly increasing our electricity usage. So finding alternative ways of building our software is going to make a difference. However, this issue of constantly increasing demand for electricity from software brings me to my next point about artificial intelligence. Now, AI is super cool, and it's come a really long way in the past year. When ChatGPT was released, I told my teammate that I had been exploring it and explained that it could write code for you. And he didn't believe me, so I asked ChatGPT to write a Terraform policy for me, which is something we do normally. And this teammate, he's probably one of the most stoic men I know. But let me tell you, when he saw this code print out in front of him, it literally brought tears to his eyes. So AI is pretty cool. And there's some really exciting innovations in the AI space, in particular for the climate mitigation area as well. So for example, AI is helping improve efficiency in production processes and supply chains, or helping improve climate disaster alert systems. Of course, then there's the other side of the conversation about the potential negative effects of AI, such as unconscious biases or the potential for AI to take over the world. But again, There isn't much discussion on the environmental impact of AI. AI is becoming more and more widespread. Everyone is doing AI at the moment. This means, however, that there are more and more complex machine learning models, more data, and consequently more power needed to run all of that. If AI continues on its current trajectory, it's expected for AI alone to account for 3.5% of the total world's electricity usage by 2030. I love this quote by Dr. Sasha Lucioni, a researcher in ethical and sustainable AI at Hugging Face. It doesn't make much sense to burn a forest and then use AI to track deforestation. It's a great reminder that as we continue to build upon and improve AI, we need to do so in a sustainable way. Another example of my first point about how software uses electricity and creates carbon emissions is the energy required to train GPT-3, the predecessor to ChatGPT. To train that model, it used approximately the same amount of electricity as would be needed to power 121 homes in the United States for an entire year. To put that in perspective, that would produce the same amount of carbon emissions as would flying from Australia to the UK 33 times. GPT-4, or ChatGPT, was trained on 570 times more parameters than its predecessor, so it's likely to have used much more energy. This is yet another example of how software contributes to carbon emissions. So, what can you do to change the way you build AI to achieve the same outcomes, but in a much more efficient way? Well, some great places to start are cleaning up your data storage policies and ensuring you're only keeping what you really need. Using the most efficient architecture and machine learning patterns for your models so that your models are running in the most efficient way. Using processes and systems and instance types that are optimized for machine learning models. Computing in the cloud rather than on-premise. Or, as I talked about before, making your models carbon aware, so training them at times or running them at locations that will have a lower carbon intensity. Or it's also important to think about ways that we can better manage the flood of data that is needed to run AI so that servers are used in the most efficient way possible and not sitting idle with large amounts of CPU. So these practices are all a few examples of ways you can just change the way that you build your AI and still achieve the same outcome, but in a way that uses electricity much more efficiently. The next point I want to move on to is e-waste. Manufacturing is one of the largest consumers of electricity and fossil fuels, and 25% of all carbon emissions in 2022 came from the manufacturing industry. Earlier, I mentioned how 2/3 of the world's electricity generation still comes from fossil fuels. However, if we talk about energy as a whole, so electricity, transport, and heat, 82% of the world's energy still comes from fossil fuels. So we've got an even longer way to go there. The manufacturing industry is really difficult to decarbonize because many industrial processes require chemical reactions and high temperature heat that currently can't be decarbonized with commercially available technology. Manufacturing machinery is often not replaced very often either, so it's difficult to bring in newer, efficient technologies. This chart here shows the rate of increase in e-waste since 2015 until 2030. Have a think about all the devices that we're now using. You've got your phone, your laptop, your tablet, smartwatch, smart fridge, smart front door lock. All of these devices are contributing and increasing the amount of e-waste. In fact, we can see on the blue line on this chart that by 2030, it's expected that the world will produce 74.7 million tonnes of e-waste. On the red line at the bottom of this chart, we see the amount of e-waste that is being recycled. Not only is it a much, much smaller proportion than the total amount of e-waste, it's not increasing at the same rate as e-waste is either. This is partly due to having an industry that's focused on selling new models all the time. And it's really easy when people find their phone is running a bit slow, or newer software versions aren't compatible with their device, or they don't have the latest security update. It's easy to just throw away that device and get a new one. However, this is all contributing to this rising amount of e-waste. All the devices that we're using produce carbon when they're manufactured, and again will produce carbon when they're disposed of. This is what we call embodied carbon, the amount of pollution created when a device is manufactured and disposed of. We can measure embodied carbon by amortization, or gradually writing off the cost of a server or a device. So for example, in this chart here, say we've got one server and we expect that server to last for 4 years. We also assume that this server is going to produce 4,000 kilograms of CO2 when it's created and disposed of. So using amortization, we can say that this server emits 1,000 kilograms of CO2 per year. But what would the impact be if we increase the lifespan of that server by just 1 year? Well, now we can see that this server only produces 800 kilograms of CO2 per year. Very quickly, we can see how just increasing the lifespan of these devices is going to make a big difference in reducing the amount of carbon being produced. Of course, hardware doesn't do anything without the software that runs on it. So we in the tech industry have a big part to play in this chain. So what can you do to influence people to take a bit longer before they get rid of their device? This is simply things like taking a bit longer, or allowing, providing support for older versions of software for a little bit longer. Reviewing your hardware that you're using, or the instance types that you're using, so that they're the best ones for the type of workload you're running, so that that server is being used in the most efficient way to make it last longer. Keeping up to date with new instance types that are being created that have energy efficient improvements, and shifting your workloads onto those new instance types. Of course, configuring auto scaling correctly, or ensuring that your website or application still runs efficiently on older devices, and testing your application on those older devices to see how it performs. Now let's look at some even smaller examples of alternative ways of achieving the same outcome, but in a way that uses electricity more efficiently. Decreasing the amount of code sent over the internet is a key way to reduce the amount of electricity used. A developer and blogger named Danny Van Kooten runs a WordPress plugin, and this plugin is used on over 2 million different websites around the world. One day, he decided to refactor his plugin code, and he removed one JavaScript dependency. Now, that plugin, each time it's loaded, sends just 20 kilobytes less data. Now, 20 kilobytes really doesn't seem like much at all. Who really cares about 20 kilobytes of data? But he did some rough calculations and worked out that this change resulted in reduced global carbon emissions by 59,000 kilograms of CO2 every month. Again, to put that in perspective, that's equivalent to 85 flights from Amsterdam to New York. Pretty crazy. And just think, that was through one really small and easy change. Think about how many changes that you can make to a package that you use in your application, or the amount of data that you're sending over an API. Another interesting factor is web page size. Web page size has increased significantly in the past decade. In 2010, the average web page size on a desktop was just under 500 kilobytes. In 2021, it had increased to over 2,300 kilobytes, a 386% increase. So when you're designing a website, how can you change the way you build that to use electricity more efficiently? This is things like reducing the size of the data that you transmit to your client, minimizing the complexity of the document object model on the front end. Perhaps you could set company standards or guidelines on the maximum size for a web page so that teams consistently work to keep your web page size under that guideline. Another pattern is avoiding chaining critical requests, which block a page from loading and end up using more electricity. Or you could take advantage of edge computing principles and storing data and assets closer to your users, so you don't need to use as much electricity to transfer those to your clients. Now, it's really great to take all of these actions, but to keep the momentum, we need to be able to measure the impact we're having. Of course, if you want to be able to use company resources to do something, you need to prove and back up why it's important and making an impact. The Green Software Foundation has created a specification called the Software Carbon Intensity Guide. And this is a formula that enables you to calculate the rate of carbon emissions for a software system. The score depends on three things: the energy consumed by the system, the rate of carbon emitted depending on the location that you're running that system in, and the embodied carbon of whatever devices you're using to run that system. On their GitHub page, they've got a really great case study where a group of people have gone through and specifically set out how they've calculated a software carbon intensity for their software system. So that's a great resource to use if you're interested in this. This is something that you could do with an application of yours, perhaps even creating some sort of like monitoring dashboard to track what's influencing and changing the software carbon intensity. Another thing to think about when it comes to measuring carbon emissions is looking for things that could be emissions proxies. So if you're not able to yet get data on the actual energy and carbon emissions being used and produced, you could look for things that could indicate changes in the amount of electricity that you need. So this is things like the amount of memory being used over time or the amount of CPU used. Cloud providers themselves are also making some really great strides in providing tools to track and monitor and measure your energy use and carbon emissions. However, it's definitely an area that needs some more work. And if this is something you're interested in, finding a way to efficiently and easily get data on carbon emissions and energy use is another great action that you can take that would have a really big impact in this space. So throughout this talk, you might have been thinking a lot of these changes seem really small or like they wouldn't actually have that big of an impact. And I totally get you. But let's forget about software for a moment and move to a different industry, the airline industry. The weight of an aircraft is a key contributor to how much fuel is needed to run a flight, and therefore how much it's going to cost an aircraft to run that flight. So airlines will relentlessly look for ways to reduce the weight of the aircraft to save them some money. In 1987, American Airlines decided to remove one single olive from each of its in-flight salads. And doing so, they saved US $40,000 a year. British Airways changed the paper that it prints its in-flight magazines on to a lighter version. Virgin Atlantic changed its chocolate and sweet offerings to remove just 450 grams from each flight, but this saved them 53,000 litres of fuel per year. And finally, Thomas Cook Airlines decided to no longer print receipts for its in-flight purchases, meaning planes no longer had to carry 420,000 till rolls across its fleet. These examples show that seemingly small and insignificant changes can actually have a really large impact. Some of them, such as removing receipts from the airplanes, may have been resisted at first and seemed like they were necessary, but once they were removed, it was probably totally fine, and they just needed to make the change to realize that. So, what if you moved one data backup at your company to run at a time with lower carbon intensity? What if you switched your AI workloads to run on a more efficient instance type? What if you supported an older software version for a little bit longer? Or what if you decided to transmit a little bit less data over an API? All these small changes together could have a massive impact to reduce the amount of carbon emissions from software. You too can make a difference no matter where you work or what you do. So if you're dedicated to making one of these changes, do you think that you can help solve climate change as a software engineer? Thank you so much for coming. You can find me on LinkedIn with this QR code here and have a look and see any questions that have come through. Okay. Could you share green software best practices implemented by Xero? Yes, so the team of engineers and I that created the Kubernetes cron job, that was through a Xero hackathon. So we're working to implement that more widely at Xero, which is really exciting. And also doing things like in my team, as what I know is keeping up with different instance types and improving the more efficient practices. So we're using devices in the most efficient way. Our internal IT team is also thinking about ways that we can dispose of our devices in a more efficient way or prolong the amount of time that we use laptops for example. I think we also donate our old engineers' laptops to different charities in the community as well, so that we're not just disposing of old laptops once they're done after 3 years, for example. What are your favorite initiatives that there are today, and what projects can you give as an example? I think the things I'm most interested in are the carbon aware projects. And I think it's a really great way that you can just change the way that you're building your software in a way that's not going to affect your users in any way, but makes a big difference to what electricity is being used and how much carbon is being emitted. So yeah, I know there's the Windows 11 example that I mentioned, but there's also lots of people just trying things out and just figuring out what they can do with these APIs, and yeah, just starting to implement them in software. Another really cool example, which is slightly different but kind of relates to edge computing, which I mentioned that you can do to reduce the amount, how much electricity is used to transmit your data to your users, is Microsoft has also been testing having data centers underwater. And the idea is that 50% of the world's population lives next to water. So why doesn't our data? And it'll be really interesting to see the follow-on of that testing and that project, to see how that impacts the amount of electricity that's needed. For example, you probably won't need to spend as much electricity to cool your data servers if they're at the bottom of the ocean, for example. and also could be a way to reduce the length of the space that's needed to send your data across. Are there any standards or certifications for green software? The Green Software Foundation is, it was founded a couple of years ago in May 2021 by a few different companies, I think GitHub and Accenture and a few others. And over the past couple of years, they've been doing a lot of work to really build up awareness in the green software space and produce a lot of resources to help people. So they've got a green software certification that you can take and do a test, and you can have this certification. They provide a lot of information on best practices and like patterns that you can use while you're building your software, and just doing a lot of advocacy work as well, which is really cool. What tools and technologies are available for measuring software's environmental impact? So the cloud providers have a few different options. So AWS, for example, has a carbon tracking tool as part of their cost tracking software. It started off as not super helpful because it would just provide the total energy use for an entire region, for example, and so you couldn't really scope it down to your specific application. And so if you're making a small change, it's really difficult to see if that was having an impact. They're slowly improving that, and now you can scope it down to different services, I believe, but it's still an area that's needs more work to hopefully be able to see it specifically for each service, each type of deployment, for example. And other data providers, I think, have similar options as well. And there's also a few open source options as well. How can I calculate the carbon emissions of my software project? Probably the best way at the moment is the software carbon intensity guide. So going onto their GitHub and going through the formula, going through the steps. There's a 5-step process that gets you to think about, well, you have your software system, but what about the system that deploys the application? What about the monitoring systems that you have in place? All this contributes to the electricity that's used to run that system. So how can you get all the different sources from there? You can use, say, for example, you know the type of instance that you're running your project on, and so you can get like standard electricity usage for that instance type if you can't get the specific data, for example. So a few options, and as I mentioned, it's still difficult and needs a space that needs work, but there's definitely work happening in that space, which is really exciting. Cool.
Okay, great. Thank you, Annie, for the very informative and interesting talk, and thank you for answering all these questions. It is really a pleasure to have you today with us, and thank you for raising awareness and for sharing all this valuable visual information that you have. And feel free to share interesting links with us so we can add them in the description of the video, so people can use them for their projects as well later on. Thank you again, and hope to see you soon.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and always love chatting about green software. So if anyone wants to reach out, I'm always up for a chat.
Bye bye.